Hello, I'm Jonna Till Johnson, CEO of Nemerdes, here with my co-host,
John Burke, CTO of Nemerdes.
and you're listening to Heavy Strategy, the show that tries to ask the right questions, not give the right answers. Before we jump into today's episode, I wanted to give some follow-up. Brian Ward writes regarding episode 110, talking about the quantum cryptocalypse. You missed out on a perfect opportunity for a quantum relevant joke. You'll know how fast quantum computers are coming, but you don't know where on the timeline they'll arrive. So that's a Heisenberg uncertainty principle joke, which I think is pretty damn good.
Yep, we enjoy that. I'm going to throw in that we can, now that we've really gotten comfortable saying cryptocalypse, we can just switch to saying Y2Q, which somebody introduced me to not too long ago.
Yes.
Much easier.
At one of our Nemerdes live talks, we had Juan Moreno, who is the quantum evangelist at Amazon Web Services, talking about Y2Q, and we were like, "Oh, that's cute." By the way, he thinks it's about 2030 is his best bet for it.
He has a countdown clock.
He has a countdown clock on his slides. It's very cool. Anyway. On today's show, we're talking about a different risk, which is the risk of your cloud provider cutting you off. And to provide a little bit of background, a couple of weeks ago, earlier this summer, I should say, an Indian energy company had paid up all of its cloud's contracts with Microsoft, but Microsoft abruptly pulled the plug on everything, Teams, Azure, and everything, because the EU was putting pressure on the energy company in order to enforce sanctions with Russia, in other words, for geopolitical purposes. So basically, here is this energy company feeling like, oh, we're fine. We paid up our providers, suddenly getting slapped in the face, relatively hypothetically speaking, or whatever, being told, oh, you suddenly are dead in the water because you can't use your cloud services, which kind of alerts us all to the question of, should this be on your bingo card going forward? John, before we jump into, why this might be, I think the question is it legit to say this should be on your bingo card, that potentially a provider of your core services is going to suddenly stop providing those services for political reasons? And I do want to weigh in on a different follow-up on that as well.
Yes, I think it has to be on everyone's bingo card. It should have been on everyone's bingo card all along. As it should be with any kind of service contract. We're used to, as businesses, having service contracts with dispute clauses and, the recourse of going to court to resolve a dispute over services, the failure to deliver them, failure to pay for them, whatever. It is not the sort of service that folks are used to applying that kind of thinking to, because, if your garbage doesn't get collected on time every week, you can probably get by and keep operating day to day while you start the dispute in court, get some kind of injunction, continue service, find another garbage company. The same isn't true if your email goes away, if your cloud storage goes away, if all those software applications that you're running up in Amazon or Azure, if they suddenly go away. So, we know people probably have some in the moment planning for this on a, we've lost our WAN connections and we're not going to have access to the cloud until they come back up. But that's always with the expectation that they'll just come back up when the network problems are resolved, or the equivalent technical issue. But this isn't a technical issue, and that kind of plan shouldn't stretch this far. So yeah, real issue.
And actually, you're sort of backing up someone who wrote in. We talked about this on Network Break episode 537. And on that episode, we made the comment, it's never really come out that a company that's doing service providing has been under pressure from a larger organization asking them to remove a company because of political ideology or as a pressure campaign. And the person responded by saying, I'd like to point out that several companies had this happen to them due to government pressure and without a court order, the most newsworthy being AWS Apple taking down Parler in 2021. That's in the US. Now, what's interesting there is that was not under government pressure. This was not the equivalent of the government saying, make this so. This was actually Amazon saying, we don't want you as a customer anymore because we don't like the fact that you're allowing content that, and this is a direct quote, threatens the public safety, such as by inciting and planning the rape, torture, and assassination of named public officials. I'm kind of with Amazon on that one. Like, no, I really don't want to be promoting that kind of behavior. The main thing here is it wasn't government pressure. It was Amazon's decision. That said, it's still the same problem, which is somebody bigger than you who is controlling your provider, controlling the provision of essential services suddenly said, nah, we don't want to do that anymore. And the question is, what recourse do you have and how do you protect against that? Because your standard, disaster recovery and business continuance plans make the assumption, John, as you said, that like the network will come back. Like basically there's some assumption here that we haven't hit the end of the world, that resources will return and that there isn't malevolent interest from the standpoint of the customer. From the standpoint of Parler or the standpoint of the Indian company, there isn't malevolent action by the provider that will preclude stuff coming back. And so that's a different category of risk to actually think about and plan for, but it's something that people really, I think, have to do. And one of the questions is, where in your risk planning should this even fit? Is this like an incident response event? Is this a BCP event? And then how would you mitigate? Is this a technology mitigation? Is this do you just sort of throw up your hands and say, oops, sorry, we're dead in the water for the next 2 months while we figure out what to do because the EU got mad at us? I don't know.
And I think companies of a sufficient size to have risk management and risk mitigation as a corporate function probably have to take into account the possibility that some operation or some aspect of their operations or business becomes illegal. Think about prohibition. I'm selling liquor. It's illegal. I can't sell liquor anymore. And when that happens, there's got to be, basically contingency plans in place for ceasing those operations and continuing on with other parts of the business.
We're going to sell opium instead. Oh, wait.
If they got the timing right.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So at some level in the business, there should be people who have thought about what happens when you run afoul of your own government or of any legal regime that has actual teeth applying to you. What's really interesting to me about this example is that it wasn't India's government that leaned on the provider to do this to an Indian company operating in India. It was another government outside leaning on a provider who's multinational, although they have operations in India, to get them to do something to an Indian company that was obeying the law in India. So although I suspect there's some framework within which those companies are prepared to deal with having to divorce themselves from some aspect of their operations in response to political pressure or political changes, IT has never been one of them.
Well, that's
so, I think probably business continuity planning is the right way to think about it, and to think about this as essentially a disaster from which you need to recover, as opposed to an incident that you need to respond to. So I'm putting my first stake down in the ground saying it's probably BCP, not IRP stuff.
I would go a step further and say, quite frankly, this is a perfect example of the overlap between IT risk and enterprise risk. The problem with building an effective risk management and risk mitigation program is that the universe of possible risks is so wide that people feel like, oh my God, I'm going to have to boil the ocean. And as we've talked about many times over the years, the problem is there's usually a chief risk officer whose job it is to kind of compute the likelihood of every possible risk, present that information to the company, wipe the chalk dust off their hands and walk away. There is not in most organizations a CRMO, which would be a chief risk mitigation officer. That mitigation, to the extent it even exists, is usually split between the organizations that are sort of the most logical fixes. Like, hey, if the risk is that the government will suddenly declare your product illegal, we need a lobbyist group to go down to Washington in the United States or wherever else. And that's great, but in a lot of cases, these risks are so broad that strategy may not work. And more broadly, I think the first thing that needs to happen is IT needs a seat at the table to talk about IT risk and cyber risk generally in the organization, and then connect that upwards to broader risk. So, hey, if this thing happens, there's only a handful of potential really bad things that can happen to a company. One of them is operations could stop happening. IT is generally pretty synced into that risk because most IT risks result in operations stop happening. In some cases, they're broader, like people die, because if your operational technology network gets compromised, you can kill people in some sorts of organizations. But I think there also has to be kind of a two-way communication. So it's not just IT saying, hey, if we get compromised, the company will stop operating. But hey, legal, hey, the folks responsible for geopolitics, what are the odds that we are going to run afoul of someone politically? And then the last thing I want to sort of toss in there, John, is I kind of think of this as almost a supply chain risk issue.
Yeah.
Because in some sense, what we're really asking about is if somebody several steps up the chain gets mad or malevolently takes action, you could be in a world of hurt without ever having known that happened in the first place. The usual example is some hostile foreign nation puts a bug in your hardware or software. That's sort of a classic case. That's what everybody talks about when they think of supply chain risk. But there's also the case that some service gets passed through the control of a government that is in a position to put pressure on that provider, a government, in this case, the EU, that can put pressure on that provider, in this case, Microsoft, to turn off a service. And I think, yeah.
No, I was just going to go off on a different direction. So please, if you had more on that, continue.
I was just going to say, I think this is a subset of your supply chain issue, but a clear case in which supply chain and supply chain risk and geopolitical risk overlap. That's all.
Yeah. So I got to thinking that, it's a lot more like having the EU lean into your electrical utility and say, why don't you just stop giving them electricity? And then you just can't do anything. And I was thinking one of the reasons why that's unlikely is because there's such a web of regulation and law saying you can't just cut somebody's utilities off. There has to be cause and process. And with cloud contracts, that doesn't happen. There's no requirement in the contract for 30 days notice before we cut you off or anything else.
Actually, there usually is, but it only applies to we cut you off for cause. So we give you 30 days to remedy our, you didn't pay us, give us the money or
right.
Those
right.
kinds of
things you'd expect for a service that you're paying for. But there's no guarantee beyond that. If you're in good standing, you've paid up, and you're within the bounds of the acceptable use policy for the site. And of course, that's the Parler story, is they were outside Amazon's own acceptable use policies. If you're inside those policies, there's an expectation that service will continue, but no obligation for service to continue. So it might be the sort of thing that corporate lawyers for the larger corporations can write into their contracts, that no cessation of services for any reasons outside these ones detailed, failure to pay, acceptable use behaviors, no cessation of services outside those boundaries without 60 days notice and a process. But
Yeah. I think where you're going is exactly correct. And I think that's one of the mitigation strategies. If you're listening, you probably want to take away from this is to talk to your corporate lawyers. Like, can you put that in the contract? I want to dig on that a little bit, but I want to circle back to something you said earlier, which I thought was interesting, which is that, it's unlikely that the EU is going to come pressure your utility company to take your utilities away. Well, yeah, but the only reason for that is because the EU doesn't actually have jurisdiction in India. And that gets back to my supply chain issue,
well,
which is
neither do they have jurisdiction in India.
no, but they have jurisdiction where Microsoft operates. So the difference here is, and that's why I keep highlighting supply chain as an issue, is one thing you have to know is where might the people who are swinging the big clubs, where are your vulnerabilities to them? Because like none of us would have thought, oh, hey, Microsoft's not headquartered they're headquartered in Seattle, not the EU. And they're certainly not headquartered in India. So how the hell can the EU thump on Microsoft to take this action? The issue is that it can, and I'm a techie. I'm not a geopolitical risk expert, but that's the kind of thing that your geopolitical risk experts should be telling you in a large organization. Yeah, go.
I was just going to say, and on that thought chain, as you try and negotiate, you can't just cut my services off without warning me clauses into your contracts. Add specific language that says political pressure on some part of your organization by some entity outside your organization does not constitute force majeure. Because
that I think is what, but you're going to have a hell of a hard time getting that, because almost if you look at U.S. and most older countries' telco regulations, which I used to cover very, very carefully, one of the things they always point out is if the government asks us to do it, we will do it as long as the government follows this process. Do they submit a warrant or whatever it is that they need? Is the warrant specific on what they want to look at? Is it bounded in time? And all these things are requirements that they push. But
for a legal process pursued legally.
Yes. But here's the gotcha. That's fine if you've got a telco in a geography governed by a particular government. Now we have a scenario where any global government can, in theory, put pressure on any provider anywhere without the processes may be very different. The governments may not agree to the same processes. And oh, by the way, I don't know that the outcome would have been very different for the poor Indian company, because Microsoft would simply say, yeah, the EU followed its process, which happens to be they tell us to cut it out and they tell us to jump and we jump how high and we ask how high. So that, to me, is the real risk here. It's the fact that this is no longer nicely bounded by geography, where you can put a clause like that in a contract and have it mean something. I mean,
it might mean nothing more than standing for suing somebody.
But in
Indian court, saying, you cut off my services here, even though the government here didn't tell you to do that or follow any legal process to make you do it. So you owe me, and you owe me not just whatever I paid you, but also damages.
Yes, but okay. First of all, I think we can agree that you should at least consider putting clauses in here that have some kind of timeline in here. So like, okay, Microsoft, you want to cut off our services because you don't like something the Russians, whatever. I haven't pieced that together and probably should, but it doesn't matter for the purposes of this. Okay, Microsoft, you have to give us 60 days and you have to give us warning 60 days before you cut us off for any reason, even though we may not agree that you have the right to cut us off for any reason, but at least you have that time frame. And then we can talk about what you do with those 30 and 60 days. But circling back on this, the other thing I would suggest is I don't know how to put this politely, so I kind of won't. When you're when you're outside the world where you have comfortable rules that you and your own government can negotiate contracts and have a reasonable expectation that the legal pathways will be followed, you can't really use the law of the rules of rules or the rules of law. You actually have to step back and say, fine, I want to be able to club you where it hurts. And I think the right to sue doesn't get you there. So you're going to have to think about how you can actually cause enough pain, because at the end of the day, Microsoft is just going to avoid the greatest source of pain. If what you can do to Microsoft is bigger than what the EU can do to Microsoft, you win. If it's not,
it's cynical, but I suspect it's true. And it also indicates that folks in small places, by internet standards, will have little or no leverage over global providers versus someplace like the EU, the US, Russia, China, who might be able to swing a fair amount of pressure because they're big.
Exactly. I mean, you get to mob rule, which is really what I was trying to avoid saying, but that's really what it is. It's warlord rule. You have to attach yourself to the most powerful warlord and hope he clobbers your enemies, which is really not a pleasant place to be, but here we are. But just to circle back on that, for telecom negotiations, for example, we have for 25 years now recommended that no, you should not put in clauses that give you credits for failure. No, that doesn't hurt the telco enough to cause them not to do the thing you want them to not do. What you need is the right to terminate without penalty, which I suspect is about the only recourse you could have with a Microsoft. You do this, we are terminating without penalty. We are not paying you any money ever. And this gets back to what your mitigation strategy should be, which is, in this particular case, you should have a Microsoft-free go-forward strategy. If they do this to you, you're gone. They just lost a customer. And I would also recommend that this strategy be a combined public relations and technical strategy. In other words, okay, these apps we're going to shift to Google. These apps we're going to shift to this provider. These apps we're going to shift to this provider, and these functions we're going to bring in-house. And here's our plan to do all that if they drop the ban hammer on us.
And here's our plan to advertise how we got rid of Microsoft, and so can you.
Exactly. And I think, kind of circling back to the main premise of this episode, sadly, we're in a position where you're going to have to think about that. Think like it's military strategy, and where could they hurt us so badly that we're crippled? And then what you want to do is, in your contracts can buy you time. Not always, because it's no guarantee that Microsoft will, or any other large player, Amazon, IBM, I don't care. Name your large player of choice. But there's no guarantee that they will abide by those time constraints. They may just ignore them. And what are you going to do? Sue them? But your contract should clearly read that when that happens, first of all, they owe you everything you paid them to date up to a certain point. You may never collect that, but it should at least be there. You should at least have the option. And then you will pay them not a dime more, and you will migrate from them to someone else, which technically I can say, I can kind of rattle off what you need to consider. It's a lot harder than to do that than to say so. But this is why you should have no single provider dependence that cuts so deeply that they can literally make you dead in the water, I guess is what it comes down to.
By an intentional and untelegraphed act. Yes, exactly.
Intentional and untelegraphed.
That's what I said. Yeah.
Oh, you said unintentional.
No.
Intentional and untelegraphed, yes.
Yeah, so I think this is something that you and I have talked about more than once, and probably Greg and you more than once in the preceding years, which is having contingency plans for jumping providers. And a lot of people think about it in the IaaS space, and they think about it less frequently in the SaaS space. We'll switch from Microsoft to Google. We'll switch from Google to Microsoft, and it is a good indicator of flexibility in an organization if they not only think about that on a regular basis, but they actually practice balancing clouds against each other on an ongoing basis. They are in both Amazon and Azure and maybe Google as well, or Google and Amazon, or Google and Azure, on an ongoing basis. And they've got work going into both clouds. And they've got teams using some kind of email on one side of the organization and a different kind of email on the other side of the organization. And they're making it work on an ongoing basis. So they're always ready to say, okay, provider A is screwing us. We're going to have to go to provider B for everybody, and then find provider C to put half our people on in the future. Folks who are in that kind of a position have a much better prospect of weathering this kind of political storm than folks who have put all of their, operational reliance on a one-legged stool.
And John, I love that you're bringing this up, and I think you're 1,000% correct. I would say, sort of more broadly, it brings back the old days. When we were talking about MPLS, for example, pre-MPLS, we always used to recommend that you go to one provider for your voice and another provider for your data, for exactly that reason, because it's technically easier to swap one piece of your network if they already were separated. Now, this is all pre-voice and data integrated. So I think, number one, not having all your eggs in one basket for any key function is critical, and it also runs absolutely counter to the strategies that people have gotten very sloppy on for the past, 10, 15 years of the big rock strategy. Well, we just sign up with Microsoft. We just sign up with Cisco. We're good. That's it. They're Palo Alto. Palo Alto is the next one trying to go for that. I think that is the risk of doing so is shooting up dramatically based on not just geopolitics, but also the sophistication of cyber attacks. And also just economic realities. So unfortunately, the idea that you can go to one provider, negotiate the hell out of your terms with them, and then sit back fat, dumb, and happy for 10 years with that provider, that's over. And if that's your strategy, you're at risk. But
this should also impel people to reimagine and reevaluate their on-premises strategy and what kinds of things they want to maintain at least some of in infrastructure they actually control against the possibility of these kinds of things happening.
Completely agree. And of course, the flip side of that is you have, geographical and geological risks and weather risks and things like that.
Always, yeah.
But the other thing that I think is sort of bigger than everything we're saying here is you really need to take a military strategy approach to your resources at this point, which means you have to assume not that someone is going to try their best to deliver the services, and only if they get kind of a little sloppy and, make mistakes are they going to fail, or if they're compromised, they're going to fail. You have to assume that at any given point, anyone you're doing business with may be an enemy. And like an actual enemy, as in going to war with them, but also an enemy as in some third party will put enough pressure on them to behave in not your best interests. And when
if not an enemy, an instrument in the hand of an enemy.
Yeah. Yeah. But basically, the flipping the switch I'm talking about is most IT folks don't run around thinking, oh my gosh, the evil aliens of planet Zoran are going after our routers. They're like, okay, what if we fat finger this configuration, right? Like, it's a different level of risk. And sadly, I think IT, as well as the rest of the organizations, need to start really thinking, what if somebody's going after us intentionally? Now, if you're listening to this from a government agency, you're laughing at me because you guys have been doing this for 50 years, 80 years. I would argue that most commercial entities, and certainly a lot of the not-for-profits like universities, really haven't thought this way because that hasn't been part of our DNA. It just hasn't.
Well, and I just wanted to come back to that idea of military thinking. One of the primary tenets of strategy development in a military campaign is planning not just for what you think the enemy will do, but for anything they can do. And so in addition to framing everybody that you've got a dependency on as potentially an enemy, you need to think about not just what you think they will do, but what you think they could do based on that dependency, based on the technologies that you depend on them for specifically. So, yeah.
Right. It's like taking a good cybersecurity view, like where are your real vulnerabilities? And the thing is, it may not be what you think they are, particularly in supply chain type attacks. And the reason I keep mentioning supply chain is that the supply chain here is an institutional supply chain, not, it's not like the EU was putting bugs in Microsoft software, but they were putting pressure on Microsoft, which is basically the same thing. Nobody saw that one coming. So,
and people aren't used to thinking of their DNS provider as a supply chain with a risk associated with it, aside from their services go down accidentally. What if somebody instead says, hey, why don't you redirect all of their stuff to this, which is a government site that says you shouldn't be selling oil to Russia? Right. So anybody who tries to access your stuff gets a message from the government.
And I believe that was the issue, actually, John. They were selling oil to
that
Russia.
was totally the thing, is they were avoiding sanctions or helping Russia avoid sanctions. Yeah.
Yeah. Which, in some sense, you could have said they should have known. But honestly, you can sit there and say they expected to get smacked in the face in some, political venue. They did not expect to have their email systems go down. Right.
Right. Exactly.
And I think that's kind of the moral of the story here, which is if you are involved in any degree of IT risk in your organizations, even lightly, you want to start thinking about where you intersect with the bigger risk picture and encouraging a culture of, yes, but what if XYZ provider or PDQ system goes rogue? And it can go rogue for reasons, well, John, as you were saying, it's not just what you think they will do. Like nobody would have said Microsoft's going to pull the plug on an email system until it happened. What could they do? So start looking at everything technically in your organization, and that's going to drive behavior that smells inefficient because global supply chains are way more efficient than local supply chains, but they're also riskier. Having a single provider is much more efficient from the standpoint of provider management than having multiple providers, but it's also riskier.
It's like paying for insurance in a way. And, that degree of inefficiency is or should be in your mind insurance against an unseen or unforeseen and unexpected and really unexpectable interruption of services.
Yeah. And so I would say, in addition to all of that, and in addition to writing tighter contracts where possible, with the understanding that globally there's little to no enforcement of these contracts, I think the other thing you should be doing is really in-depth wargaming. And this is something we have some experience with. We do this with our clients with adaptive leadership training, which is based on war games. We were told years ago to stop talking about war games because it scares people and puts them off. I think this is an excellent time to spotlight the fact that war games are also necessary in a politically hostile, economically hostile, geologically and naturally hostile environment. And, you can think about all the hurricanes and floods that we've been seeing across all the major continents. Things are not lovely and cuddly. We're not living in the Garden of Eden, folks. And I'm afraid that quite a lot of our policies assume that we are, and that's a mistake.
Well, and recognize that this is also the governments of the world figuring out how to maintain power in an environment where an enormous amount of it has sort of silently transitioned into the hands of multinational corporations instead of other governments. And they're feeling their way through it and figuring out how they can still exert meaningful influence and control in an environment where non-national, transnational, multinational companies hold an enormous amount of power by dint of what they're doing and what services they're providing.
And John is looking at me funny because I suddenly spun around at my desk and started looking for a book, which is Neil Stephenson's Cryptonomicon.
Oh, yeah.
I strongly recommend that you read that because to describe that kind of a world, that's pretty much what it talks about. And I think that's an incredibly important point because we have no world government, and nor should we necessarily, because it could be a really evil thing if abused. But if nation states have declining power compared to multinational corporations, that essentially means we're in the world of mob rule. And that makes a lot of the assumptions that most of us have grown up with, because most of us grew up within the protection of nation states, although some folks grew up in nation states that were collapsing, which is a very different experience.
Yeah. It's more 19th century realpolitik, I guess I would call it. It's like, where can the state apply force to effect its ends, rather than, trying to lead by example or establish policies and international treaties and things. Where
Right.
can it exert force? And so
and not
anytime
just the state.
anytime I read a story about a trawler dragging an anchor through an international data cable, I think, I wonder which government made that trawler do that, not, oh, those poor schmucks, how'd that happen?
Right. Or which company decided to do that, who's benefiting,
Right.
Right. Like if one of those, if the Indian company were shipping oil to Russia and one of those ships hit a strange iceberg in the Indian Ocean because it hasn't melted yet, it just sort of appeared there. I would assume that someone was putting it there on purpose. So,
Yep.
yeah. Yeah. So net, I think you'll have a limited amount of control that you could put in place in contracts, but certainly something like buying yourself time, what you're really doing is giving the Microsofts of the future a little bit of wing air cover if they go back to the EU and they say, well, we can do what you've asked, but by contract, we have to give our client 60 days. I won't say there's a guarantee that you'll get those 60 days, but it increases the odds. And then you should have a plan during those 60 days for moving away from Microsoft and clearly articulating why you're moving away from Microsoft, or whoever the future entity is, because it will happen again. And part of that strategy should involve thinking through supply chains at a very high level, meaning what entities can put what power on what providers, not just, hey, where did the pieces and parts of my, product come from? And actively endorsing an approach that doesn't put all your eggs in one basket for anything that's essential. And that's going to go very, very counter to what most organizations do right now. And then, of course, war game. Call us if you want help doing that. John and I have both led these things and facilitated them. Do your own, don't care, but do it. Just basically start exercising your brain around the question of what could happen if someone in the world were powerful enough and hostile enough to take action against us. Okay. And on that very cheerful note, right? Thank you much for listening. As you are well aware, Heavy Strategy is part of the Packet Pusher Network. You can visit our website to find more great networking and technology podcasts, tutorial videos, a newsletter, a Slack channel, and lots of other cool things. We also have a merchandise store, which sells really cool mugs and hoodies and other fun stuff. You can find John and me either at nemerdes.com. You can contact us there, or you can contact either of us on LinkedIn. John, you're fairly active there, but you have to let folks know how they can reach you best.
Well, because there are like a million other people named John Burke in the world, and a substantial fraction of them on LinkedIn, just search LinkedIn for John Burke Nemerdes, and you'll find me.
Perfect. And, last but not least, as always, please do follow up if you've got comments, thoughts, whatever. Send us a message at packetpushers.net/follow-up. You can be anonymous or you can identify yourself. Doesn't much matter. Brian Ward did ask us to identify him for the quantum joke today. So thank you, Brian, for giving us a little levity to open things up with. Thank you all.